It's roughly 200,000 years ago. You're a human, not a king, not a farmer, not a philosopher, just a regular Homo sapiens, standing somewhere in East Africa, wondering where your next meal is coming from, and hoping nothing with larger teeth than you finds you first. And if you could somehow take a photograph of yourself and compare it to the 7 billion people alive today, one thing would immediately jump out. You probably wouldn't be white. You probably wouldn't be Asian. You definitely wouldn't be a redhead arguing with the sun every summer. In fact, the first modern humans almost certainly had dark skin, which raises a surprisingly interesting question. If humanity started out with dark skin, where did all the other colors come from? Because today, humans range from extremely dark to extremely light, with every imaginable shade in between. Some populations developed lighter skin, some stayed darker, some evolved entirely different genetic solutions to the exact same environmental problem. And the story of how that happened is one of the strangest examples of evolution happening in plain sight. Let's start at the beginning, the original human color. Here's something many people don't realize. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a white person, or a black person, or an Asian person. Those categories are incredibly recent. For almost 90% of Homo sapiens history, everyone lived in Africa. And Africa has a lot of sunlight, an almost ridiculous amount of sunlight. The kind of sunlight that looks pleasant on vacation, but can quietly destroy your DNA if you're exposed to it constantly over thousands of generations. Which is exactly why melanin exists. Melanin is the pigment that gives skin its darker color. More importantly, it's basically nature's sunscreen. It absorbs harmful ultraviolet radiation before that radiation can damage cells, destroy folate levels, and create all sorts of biological problems that evolution generally considers bad for survival. And in equatorial Africa, where UV radiation is among the strongest on Earth, having lots of melanin wasn't just useful, it was a massive evolutionary advantage. Generation after generation, individuals with darker skin were better protected from the environment around them. Over enough time, dark skin became the norm. Not because evolution had a preference. Evolution doesn't care about appearances. Evolution cares about one thing. Did you survive long enough to have children? That's it. That's the entire performance review. And for hundreds of thousands of years, dark skin was one of humanity's greatest biological assets. Then humans started moving. And that's where everything gets weird. The Great Migration Problem. Around 60,000 to 80,000 years ago, groups of humans began leaving Africa. Some traveled through the Middle East, others moved into Europe, others pushed eastward into Asia. Eventually, humans would reach Australia, Siberia, and somehow decide crossing into the Americas was a reasonable idea. Which sounds impressive until you remember none of them had maps, or compasses, or Google Maps desperately recalculating every 10 seconds. They just kept walking. And as humans moved farther from the equator, something changed. The sunlight changed. Specifically, ultraviolet radiation became weaker. At first, this sounds fantastic. Less UV damage, less risk, problem solved. Except not quite. Because the same sunlight that can damage your skin also helps your body produce vitamin D. And vitamin D is incredibly important. Without enough of it, bones weaken, immune systems suffer, development becomes more difficult. You can survive with too little vitamin D, but evolution doesn't reward surviving. It rewards thriving. Suddenly, the very trait that had been incredibly useful in Africa was becoming less useful farther north. Dark skin blocked UV radiation extremely effectively, but in places with much less UV radiation to begin with, that protection came with a cost. People needed to absorb more sunlight. And over thousands upon thousands of years, natural selection began favoring individuals with lighter skin. Not overnight, not in a few generations. We're talking about an evolutionary process that unfolded over enormous stretches of time, the whitening of Europe. Here's the really surprising part. The first humans who entered Europe were probably still fairly dark-skinned. Modern Europeans didn't immediately appear the moment humans crossed into the continent. For a long time, Europe was populated by people who would likely look very different from modern Europeans. Ancient DNA has completely transformed our understanding of this. Some hunter-gatherers living in Europe thousands of years ago appear to have had dark skin paired with blue eyes, which sounds like evolution accidentally randomized a character creator screen. But that's what the evidence suggests. The pale skin, commonly associated with Europe today, became widespread much later, as farming spread, as diets changed, as populations mixed, as different genetic mutations increased in frequency. Eventually, lighter skin became common across large parts of Europe because it helped maximize vitamin D production in regions with relatively low sunlight. Not because it was better, not because it was superior, simply because it worked better under those environmental conditions. That's evolution in a nutshell. No master plan, just adaptation. Now, here's where things get even stranger. Asia solved the same problem, differently. The Asian shortcut. Imagine two students taking the same math test. Both get the correct answer, but they use completely different methods. That's basically what happened with Europeans and East Asians. Both populations evolved lighter skin compared to their African ancestors. But many of the genetic changes responsible are different. They arrived at similar outcomes through separate evolutionary pathways, which is fascinating because it means evolution wasn't following a single blueprint. Different populations encountered similar environmental pressures and independently developed their own solutions. The destination was similar, the road was different, and that's something evolution does all the time. Nature is surprisingly creative, sometimes almost suspiciously creative, like it's showing off. What about everyone in between? Here's where popular discussions often fall apart. People tend to imagine human skin color as three neat categories: black, white, Asian. Simple, clean, easy to remember. Also completely wrong. Human pigmentation exists on a spectrum, a massive spectrum. As humans spread across the planet, local environments created different selective pressures. Some regions had intense UV radiation. Some had moderate levels. Some had seasonal variation. Some populations mixed repeatedly over thousands of years. The result wasn't three colors. The result was hundreds, maybe thousands, a gradual continuum stretching across continents. North Africans developed different pigmentation patterns than West Africans. Middle Eastern populations developed different patterns than Europeans. South Asians developed different patterns than East Asians. Indigenous Australians followed their own evolutionary path. Native Americans inherited traits from populations that migrated through Asia long before written history existed. Humanity didn't divide into a few neat boxes. It diversified, continuously, messily, exactly the way evolution tends to do everything. The race illusion. Here's the truly strange part. If you traveled back far enough, every human alive today would eventually trace their ancestry back to the same African populations. Every single one. The person with the darkest skin, the person with the lightest skin, the blonde Scandinavian, the Nigerian athlete, the Korean engineer, the Peruvian farmer. Go back far enough, and their family trees begin merging. Eventually, the branches become the same trunk, which means something many people find surprisingly difficult to process. The visible differences between modern human populations are actually quite recent. Humanity spent far more time looking relatively similar than looking different. The traits we often focus on today represent a tiny fraction of our species' existence, a few thousand generations, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. And underneath all those differences, humans remain remarkably similar genetically, far more similar than most people imagine. Which brings us back to that person standing in East Africa 200,000 years ago. They had no idea Europe existed, no idea Asia existed, no idea that one day humans would build cities, launch satellites, invent social media, and spend hours arguing with strangers online about things neither of them fully understand. They were simply trying to survive. Yet inside them existed the ancestors of everyone, every nation, every language, every culture, every skin color, every face you'll ever see. The incredible thing about human pigmentation isn't that we're different, it's that we're different in such predictable ways. A little more sunlight here, a little less sunlight there. Thousands of years pass, genes shift, adaptations spread, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, humanity begins painting itself in new shades. Not because we became separate species, not because we stopped being related, but because the same species encountered different worlds. So what color were the first humans? Almost certainly dark-skinned, but that's only the beginning of the story. Because every skin tone on Earth today is part of the exact same journey. A journey that started under the African sun, long before history, long before civilization, and long before anyone had words for the categories we use now. The next time you look in the mirror, you're seeing one small variation of an experiment that's been running for hundreds of thousands of years. And no matter what shade of skin is looking back at you, the story starts in exactly the same place. One species, one origin, one African beginning. Everything else came later.